Hi everyone, this is Stephanie, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make the Pintuck Patterns Ellie skirt, which is a really basic elastic waist skirt with the option to have a second tier gathered onto it. So first, let's just go over everything that you're going to need for this project. Of course, your pattern and instructions. I've got them right here, and I'll show you how to assemble your pattern in a minute. I've also got a couple yards of a lightweight fabric. I'm using this linen fabric and my coordinating sewing machine thread. Make sure you check out the size chart, which goes from sizes 0 up to 30, and figure out which size you are based off of that chart. If your waist and hip measurements fall into two different sizes, go with the size that fits your hips best, because we can adjust the waist with that elastic band, so that one is not as important as your hip measurement. And then once you know what your size is, go ahead and check the fabric yardage requirements for the view that you are looking to make. For example, if you're, let's say, a size 14 and you're looking to make view A, you'd look under this chart here, and you'll see that if you have 45-inch wide fabric, you'll need 1 3/4 cut of fabric, or if you have 57-inch wide fabric, you'll need just a yard. So it kind of depends on a variety of factors, so go ahead and check out that chart to figure out how much fabric you're going to need. So let's talk about how to go about assembling the pattern. You'll see in your instructions what it should look like once it's all pieced together. It's basically 4 columns by 4 rows. So you'll tape 4 pieces of paper together and then move down to the next row. So the way I like to do this, I'm just gonna grab some regular old paper scissors here, not my fabric scissors. And I'm gonna start cutting my paper. And I just trim off the bottom edge and the right edge where it is marked. Another important step when you're printing out a pattern from a PDF file is make sure you print it at 100% scale. And then there's usually a little test print box like this one that should tell me if everything is printing out at the right scale. So it should be 4 by 4, which this one looks like it is, which is good. Okay, so now that I have my paper trimmed, I'm gonna start taping it together. And you use these little diamonds, these gray diamonds on the side to help you line everything up, and you just line it up along that cut line. Okay, so here are all my pattern pieces assembled and cut out in my size. So you should have your skirt panel, which should look like this. And if you're doing your second tier, there's a line here where you can either cut, or I'm just gonna fold it out of the way. So I've just folded it right there along that tiered midi length line that's on here. And if you're just doing the knee length skirt, you won't need to use the bottom ruffle piece, so you can just set that aside. And then you should have a waistband piece as well. And the important thing to note here is these little arrows here that look like this against each of these edges. There's one on each of these pattern pieces. We've got one here too. So that indicates that this needs to be placed on the fold of the fabric, and we're going to cut this pattern piece on the fold. So this one, for the waistband, you're going to cut 2 of these while on the fold. Same for the bottom ruffle, you're going to cut 2 on the fold. And for our skirt panel, you're going to cut 2 on the fold. So you're going to be using each of these pattern pieces twice. So I'm going to go ahead and cut everything out. There are some layout suggestions in the pattern that you can use to help you cut everything out. But again, you can kind of, these are suggestions, so you can kind of do what you want, as long as you make sure you have 2 of each piece cut on the fold. Okay, so I'm all cut out. I've got, these are my 2 skirt panel pieces that I cut on the fold, the front and back of the skirt. I cut out a couple of these longer pieces for the bottom tier of the skirt. There's the second one. And then I've cut out 2 waistband pieces. And that's everything. Okay, so I'm gonna start with the skirt front and back, and I'm gonna place these 2 panels right sides together and align the side seams while matching the notches, and I'm gonna pin it in place. Now, if your fabric has a right side and a wrong side, make sure you have it so that the right sides are facing each other. My fabric, obviously the right side and the wrong side looks identical, so it doesn't really matter. I'm just deciding which side is going to be the outside and which side will be the inside of the garment. So there's my side seams pinned. I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew my side seams at 5/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to finish the side seams and press them towards the back. I'll show you how I end up doing that just using my regular sewing machine. So I'm just lining up the edge of my fabric with the 5/8 mark on my machine, and I'm going to stitch. Okay, so now I have my 2 side seams stitched. I need to finish my seam allowance. So there's a lot of different ways you could go about this. Of course, if you have a serger, you could use that. I'm gonna try something else today. So I've just got a little scrap of fabric that I've stitched onto here so I can test out finishing my seam allowance here. So I'm just gonna sew a zigzag stitch sort of near the edge of my seam allowance edge here, and I have set my stitch length to 1.5, and I've set the width of my stitch to 3. You could play around with that and see what you think works well with your particular machine and what you like the look of, but I'm going to start with that. There you see I've just stitched this zigzag line here to finish off my seam allowance, and you could try to stitch a little closer to the edge as well. So another option is to do a mock overlock stitch like this one I've selected here, and for that one I'm going to use this little overlocking foot as well. Again, if you don't have that, you can just stick with the zigzag stitch. This is just another option that you might have with your particular sewing machine. So I recommend you kind of play around with the different stitches available on your sewing machine to see what works for your fabric and how you'd like to finish your seam allowance. So there we go, that's what it looks like once it's stitched, and it does create a really nice clean finish. For the next step, I'm going to work on the waistband. Place your 2 waistband pieces, which is pattern piece B, right sides together, and align the short edges while matching the notches and pin together along those short edges. Now I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew these edges at 5/8 of an inch. After that, I'll press the seam allowances open. So make sure you take note of the settings that you used to finish your seam allowance so that you can change your settings back to that later. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and change this back to just my standard straight stitch, about 2.5 stitch length. So now we want to attach our waistband to our skirt. So I'm going to take the upper skirt that I created earlier and turn it so that it's right side out. Remember that the top edge is that edge that has that curve along the top of the side seam. There we go. And I have just notched right here where the center of this panel is. That can be helpful sometimes in helping you match this up. Now take your piece here and you're going to lay it so that the skirt and the waistband are right sides together. And we're just going to pin the waistband in place all the way around, matching up our notches and matching up our side seams. And the raw edge here of the waistband is lined up with the raw edge of the top of the skirt. So near the center back of the skirt, I'm gonna make a mark here, a couple of marks about 4 inches apart. So we're gonna stitch all the way around the skirt at 5/8 of an inch along the top edge here, but we're gonna leave this little section, this like 4-inch gap, unstitched so that we can use that to insert our elastic. A lot of times when I'm sewing in the round like this, I'll just pop off my extension table. And I'm going to start near that center back at one of those marks, remembering to leave this part undone. So now I'm approaching where I started stitching, so I'm going to stop stitching right about here. And I'll just back stitch. There we go. So now I'm just going to go around my skirt and I'm going to press the seam allowance of the waistband down towards the bottom of the skirt and press the waistband up and away from the skirt. So now I'm going to go ahead and finish the seam allowance of most of this waistband and skirt, but I am not going to finish it where we left that gap because we still need to leave this section unstitched. So I'm just going to start finishing the seam allowances in the same place where I left off stitching. So go ahead and switch your settings back to whatever you use, your zigzag stitch or mock overlock stitch to finish your seam allowance. So I'm going to switch out my foot. So you can see I didn't finish the seam allowance and I didn't stitch in this little gap right at the center back, which is perfect because that is where I'm going to be inserting my elastic now. So to determine how long to make your elastic, go ahead and just take it and wrap it around your natural waist or wherever you want your skirt to sit. And I'm just gonna pull my other skirt so it's not in the way. You can do this against your bare skin or against a tight-fitting t-shirt. And kind of just determine, pull it slightly, but not so much that it's uncomfortable for you. And wherever you find it to be comfortable, you're just gonna make a mark at that point. From there, you'll just add about an inch for our overlap, and that's where you're actually going to cut it. So to insert my elastic, I'm just going to attach a safety pin to one end. Sometimes I also will attach one to the other end, just in case I decide I need to pull on that end as well. Okay, so we're gonna go in through that gap that we left at the back of the skirt. Into the waistband casing. So I'm just using that safety pin to help me push my elastic through this casing. So now you just want to make sure there's no twist in your elastic, and you're gonna lay it right on top, one piece of elastic right on top of the other, and there should be an overlap of 1 inch, so go ahead and measure. To test the fit, sometimes before I stitch it together, you can just connect it together with an overlap of 1 inch with your safety pin. Try it on and see if it is the right amount of tightness for you, and if it's not, you can go ahead and overlap it more or trim down the elastic until you get the right fit. Once you're happy with the tightness of the elastic, go ahead and pin it in place with a 1 inch overlap. So my favorite way to do this is to do a little box stitch. So I'm just gonna draw myself a guideline here. I'm gonna stitch a little rectangle with a cross in it, and I'll show you how I stitch that. So to stitch this in place, you probably need to pull out a bit more of the elastic. I'm gonna start by stitching along one side of this rectangle I just drew. And we're gonna need to back stitch. And I'm just using a regular old straight stitch here, even though this is stretchy. Okay. So did one side of my rectangle. I'm gonna do the top of the rectangle here. So basically I end up doing one side, the top, and then the other long side of the rectangle. And then instead of stitching across the bottom now, what I'll do is I'll turn, and I'm going to do one of those diagonals. And then turn and stitch again across that top. Once I'm in that other corner, I'm going to stitch a diagonal line. And finally turn, and I will stitch across the bottom. and then back stitch. And there you go. That's how you do the box stitch. It's a really secure way of securing your elastic. Now where we have that hole at the back of the waistband, I want to close that up now. So I'm gonna go ahead and pin the waistband and skirt together there. And try to keep your elastic out of the way. There we go. And if everything looks good, go ahead and finish that seam allowance and that little gap there as well. Now optionally, you can do some top stitching to keep your elastic from twisting in place. So I like to do a row at 1/2 inch from this edge and then a second row at 1 inch from the edge. So you end up having 2 rows of top stitching about 1/2 inch apart. So to do this, I just use my regular old straight stitch, and before you begin, you might want to just make sure that your side seams are at the sides so that everything is kind of evenly distributed. And I just might want to place a few pins to keep everything in place. Okay, now I'm just going to start stitching, I think at the back center, and wherever we stitch, you're just going to make sure wherever you're stitching, you're stretching out the fabric as much as possible. So I'm going to place this at 1/2 inch, back stitch a little, and then let's stitch all the way around. So that's what it looks like with one row. I'm going to do the whole thing again with my second row. So there we go. That's what it looks like when the waistband is all secured and top stitched, and I just really like that the way that feels, and I like that the waistband isn't gonna twist around inside of the casing. Okay, so if you are just making view A, go ahead and try on your skirt to check the length and trim it if necessary. Once you hem it, the skirt will be 1 1/4 inches shorter, so keep that in mind. Then you would just press the raw edge of your hem towards the wrong side at 1/4 inch and press that with your iron all the way around, and then turn it up again at 1 inch and press that again. And then you would just edge stitch to secure that hem. But I'm going to be adding a bottom ruffle to my skirt, so I'm going to set my skirt aside for the moment, and I'm going to grab my 2 bottom ruffle pieces, and we're going to lay them right sides together and align the side seams of both edges and pin in place. So there we go, I've pinned both panels together along the side seams, and I'm going to stitch that at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to finish my seam allowances and press this seam allowance towards the back panel. So if you didn't already do it when you were cutting out, you'll want to go ahead and mark the center front and center back of your tier which I've already done here. And then what you can do in addition is you can kind of mark the halfway point between your center front and side seams. So here, and you can do that by you can measure if you've got a ruler, or you can kind of just fold where your stitching line is here to the center, and I just kind of pinch this side to kind of finger crease it, and then I'm just gonna snip right there. Just make sure you keep your snips shallow. And then I'll do the same thing here. I'll just take my side and bring it to the center front. And then this part right here, finger crease. And then I'll just snip right there to mark that. So now I have marked, basically I have, including the side seams, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 notches to help me line up this tier with the tier above it. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing with the bottom of my skirt here. So if you haven't done it already, mark your center front and center back. I've already marked mine here, so then I can just take what I do is I just place the center front and center back on top of each other, then take the side seam and fold that. So that'll be, and again, you could just measure as well. This is just sort of a quick way of doing it if you don't want to get out your ruler and do some math. Plus, I like doing it this way because I can do the front and the back at the same time, which is nice. All right, now it's time to do our gathering stitches. Go ahead and change your stitch length to whatever is the longest length on your particular machine. For me, it's a 5, it might be a 4 on your machine. I also like to lower my tension. I'm gonna set it to like 1.5 or 2. That should be good. And now I'm gonna sew my rows of basting stitches. So make sure you're doing this along the edge where we've done our notches. That's important. So you'll need at minimum 2 rows of basting stitches, and I like to do 1 row at 1/4 inch and a second at 5/8 of an inch, let's say. But I often will do 3 rows actually. I feel like I can get better control with my gathers, and the threads are less likely to break if I do 3 rows instead of 2. So today I think I will do my first row. I'm starting about maybe 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch from my side seam here. Before I start, this is really important. You want to make sure you have a nice long thread tail from the top and also from the bottom. So go ahead and I'm going to pull up a thread tail from the bottom and pull that, because we'll need these thread tails later when we're gathering. So my first row I'm going to do just on the front panel at 1/4 of an inch. So stop stitching right before your other side seam and pull your thread. So again, you have a nice long thread on the other end. And then we're going to do the same thing on the back panel at 1/4 inch. So again, just pull some nice long threads before you snip those threads. And we're going to do at least one more row. So I think I will do my second row. You can do it at 5/8 of an inch or slightly longer than that, at like 3/4 of an inch. That should be fine. Okay, so now from the side that I was just stitching, from the right side of the fabric, I like to just tie off these threads. So I grab 2 threads here from just the front side, and I just knot them together with each other. And then I kind of trim it maybe like an inch away so that I don't get them confused with the other side. There we go. And I'll do the same thing with my other side seam here. Okay, so I'm just going to attach this tier to the bottom of my skirt. So I'm placing them again right sides together. And I'm just gonna first just line up the side seams with each other. I'll just pin that in place. So the raw edge of my, this is the right side of my skirt. It's facing the right side of my tier, and the raw edges are lining up, and I'm matching the side seam there. Okay, and the next thing I do is the centers. I like to just match up my center fronts and center backs with each other. So there we go. Line up the center fronts with each other. And line up the center backs with each other. And now I'm going to start to pull on my gathering stitches to start to get things into position. So just going to lay it out like that. And I've got my 2 threads on this side that I can pull. And you just want to be real careful with this so your threads don't break. So I'm just going to pull on this until this tier matches the length of the skirt here. So it doesn't have to be evenly distributed yet, just needs to be about the right length. So there we go. So right about there. And you could go in and evenly distribute it now, or what I usually do is just kind of do the whole skirt that way first. Okay, now that I've done that, I'm gonna go back in and kind of sort of arrange my gathers so that they are as even as I can get them. And sometimes it helps at this point to kind of like place this over your knees or over the end of your ironing board or something like that. But while I'm holding onto the thread, I kind of just start gently kind of arranging the gathers until they look as even as I can get them. And then to kind of fine tune it, I come in with just a pin, and you can, if you just kind of hold this area with a little bit of tension, you can kind of then just pluck on your gathers to get them to be arranged just how you want them. So I did make another notch there to match up this point. So at this point you can go ahead and use that notch. And try to get those as even as I can for each section. And then once I'm happy with the spacing of the gathers, I just put in, I tend to use a lot of pins for gathering because I don't want things to get pulled kind of out of where I want them. So I put like a pin every 2 inches basically. And because these pins like to fall out, I kind of just do like a double pierce of the fabric with it. Like I go in, out again. So that's nice and secure. And I'm going to do that all the way around the whole skirt. Alright, so it's all pinned. It's ready to stitch now. Again, we're going to stitch it at 5/8 of an inch all the way around this whole tier. And I like to stitch from the skirt side, not the tier side, because it just keeps the gathers a little bit neater if you are stitching from this side of the fabric. Now, it's really important, since the last thing that we did was a basting stitch, to make sure we change our settings on our machine back to a regular old stitch. So for me, that means making sure my stitch length is around 2.5. My tension is set back to normal. For me, that's like around 4. It might be a little bit different on your machine, so just change it to whatever standard. And then we're ready to stitch again. Okay. So I've got a lot of pins, so just go nice and slow so you can pull out those pins as you get to them. So I've gone ahead and just pulled out all those gathering threads. I don't need them anymore now that my skirt is attached. And now I'm just finishing the seam allowance on this seam. So I've just gone ahead and just pressed the seam allowance for this bottom tier up towards the top of the skirt. And this is optional, but I'm going to go ahead and top stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from this seam where I have this gathering. So I'm just going to top stitch right above it. The only thing left to do is the hem, so go ahead and try on your skirt to check the length and trim it if necessary. The hem is going to make the skirt 1/2 inch shorter. So to do that, we're going to turn up the bottom edge by 1/4 of an inch and press. I'm going to do that all the way around the bottom edge. Now turn up the bottom edge again by 1/4 inch and press. thread stitch along that folded line to secure your hem. Alright guys, so here is the finished skirt. You can see the 2 rows of top stitching along the elastic waistband, and then there is the second tier, gathered tier right here. Alright everybody, I hope you were able to follow along with this video and make your own skirt. Happy sewing!